Year 1995. Setting: USA, Oregon, the city of Weirmont, a small town in Oregon known for its idyllic atmosphere, was a quiet haven where families came seeking a peaceful life. The summer of 1995 was particularly hot, but for the locals it was a season of festivals, picnics, and sunny days by the river. Among the residents were Mark and Rachel Holloway, a couple who at first glance seemed to embody happiness. Mark Holloway was a 32-year-old professional swimmer, the pride of the local sports community. His tall stature, muscular build, and confident gait made him a noticeable figure in town. He trained daily at the local pool, preparing for upcoming competitions. His perseverance and discipline served as an example for aspiring athletes, many of whom looked up to him as their idol. Mark was a man of routine. Every morning began with a jog along the waterfront, followed by grueling workouts and evenings spent at home with his wife. Rachel Holloway, his wife, worked as a nurse at the city hospital. Her job required long shifts, but Rachel managed it with her calm and caring nature. Her fair skin, light blonde hair always neatly tied in a bun, and gentle smile gave the impression of someone you could trust. She was the one who listened to patients and supported them in their most difficult moments. To their neighbors, she was the epitome of a respectable woman balancing career and family life. Together, they seemed like the perfect couple. They lived in a cozy two-story house in the northern part of town, not far from the park. Their home was tastefully furnished but without excess. Warm, pastel tones, comfortable furniture, and family photos on the walls. In the photos, Mark and Rachel smiled, captured in moments of happiness. On the beach, during picnics, at sporting events. Their neighbors often noticed them walking together around the neighborhood or sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee. However, behind this picture-perfect facade, small cracks had started to appear in their relationship. In recent months, Rachel had been staying late at work more often, explaining it as an increased workload at the hospital. Sometimes she would come home late at night, and sometimes not until morning. At first, Mark didn't think much of it, attributing it to her exhaustion and a need for some distraction. He trusted his wife. But as time went on, these late returns became more frequent, and her explanations grew increasingly vague. Mark tried to distract himself from his growing unease by immersing himself in training. Every day, he spent hours in the pool, working on technique and endurance. His coach, Joe Ellis, noted that Mark had become less focused. He was making mistakes that were uncharacteristic of him and often seemed distracted. Although Mark didn't speak to anyone about his suspicions, his tension became noticeable. In the evenings, he would return to an empty house where the silence grew increasingly oppressive. Their home no longer echoed with laughter or cozy dinner conversations. When Rachel did come home, she looked tired and avoided long talks. She would lock herself in the bathroom for extended periods or go straight to bed. Mark began to wonder, was this just work fatigue, or was there something more? Their neighbors also noticed the changes. If Mark and Rachel used to often attend community events together, now Rachel almost always came alone or skipped them altogether. Rumors began to spread, but no one dared to speak to Mark about it. His image as a successful athlete and their reputation as the perfect couple were too strong. One day, in mid-July, Mark decided to spend the day in the park to take his mind off things. This place had always been his favorite. The wide paths, the shade of old trees, the pond with ducks, it all reminded him of peace. He loved walking here with Rachel, but that day he went alone. Despite the heat, the park was full of people. Some were reading on benches, others were walking their dogs, and children were running and playing on the playground. Mark strolled slowly, enjoying the quiet, when his gaze accidentally landed on one of the benches. His heart raced as he recognized his wife. She was standing next to a man Mark had never seen before. The man, tall with dark hair, had his arm around her shoulders, and next to them a little girl was laughing. Mark froze, watching them from a distance. The girl called Rachel Mom, and her joyful voice echoed in Mark's ears. It was a moment that shattered his entire reality. He didn't approach them. One thought pulsed in his mind. I need to know the truth. Mark pulled out his phone and took several photos. His hands trembled as he tried to keep the camera steady. He left the park, trying not to draw attention. Walking home, he felt his world falling apart. Everything he thought he knew about his life, about his wife, now seemed like a lie. At home, Mark sat alone for a long time looking through the photos. His heart was filled with a mix of anger, pain, and confusion. For the first time in months, he felt completely alone. At that moment, he didn't know what to do next, but inside him, a dark, overwhelming feeling began to grow, one that would soon change everything. After the events in the city park, Mark Holloway's world had completely lost its stability. Every movement, every word from Rachel now seemed suspicious to him. His mind constantly returned to the image of her embracing a stranger and to the voice of the little girl calling her Mom. Everything he once took as truth now seemed like a facade for something darker and more destructive. From that day on, Mark began to notice things he had previously overlooked. He started observing his wife's behavior more closely. She increasingly came home late, explaining it as overtime work at the hospital, but her explanations no longer sounded convincing. Mark recalled how she used to tell him in detail about her shifts and share stories about her patients. Now, she avoided conversations, responding with short, vague phrases. Every gesture, every pause in her answers seemed to him like part of a carefully constructed lie. The neighbors also began noticing changes in their family. If they used to see Mark and Rachel together on morning jogs or evening walks around the neighborhood, now Rachel was often seen alone. When asked about Mark, she would smile and say he was busy with training. No one asked further questions, but the atmosphere in their home no longer seemed as happy as it once did. Mark started spending more and more time alone. After morning training sessions, he would sit at home for hours, not turning on the TV or answering calls. His thoughts were consumed with analyzing what he had seen. He constantly reviewed the photos he had taken at the park. In one picture, the little girl held Rachel's hand. In another, the man leaned toward her as if telling a story, making her laugh. These moments looked so natural that Mark had no doubt this was a real family. To calm himself, he tried to rationalize the situation. Perhaps it was just a friend, and the girl was his daughter. Perhaps Rachel was genuinely helping an old acquaintance. But these thoughts quickly gave way to anger and suspicion. If it was just a friend, why was she hiding their meetings? Why had he never heard about him before? And why did the girl call her Mom? Mark started noticing details he had previously ignored. He remembered how, a few months ago, Rachel had bought a new dress, explaining that it was suitable for work. She had also started using perfume Mark had never smelled before. Her phone was always with her now, whereas before, he could easily take it to make a call or check something. Now she kept it on silent mode and placed it face down. One evening, when Rachel returned home after another long shift, Mark decided to check her clothes. In her pockets, he found a receipt from a downtown restaurant they had never visited together. The receipt listed 2 entrees and a dessert. The waiter's name, the date, and the time all matched her most recent shift. Mark sat in the kitchen, holding the receipt in his hands, feeling his anger grow. He realized he could no longer ignore what was happening. The next day, he decided to check another detail: her car. Rachel always claimed that a colleague gave her a ride home after her shifts, but this time her car was parked near the hospital. Mark, parking nearby, noticed Rachel exiting the building, but not alone. She was with the same man he had seen at the park. They spoke briefly before she got into her car and drove away. The man headed in the opposite direction. It was yet another confirmation that there was more between them than friendship. Driving home, Mark didn't know how to deal with the flood of emotions. He felt humiliated, betrayed, and powerless. His trust was shattered, and thoughts of what else he didn't know were eating him alive. His mind tried to piece together this puzzle. He thought about their wedding, the vows they had made to each other. How had it come to this? And, most importantly, why? That evening, Rachel returned home as if nothing had happened. She placed her bag on the table, kissed Mark on the cheek, and went to the bedroom without even asking how his day had been. Mark silently watched her. Her light-heartedness and carelessness seemed to only fuel his anger. He wanted her to confess, to tell him everything. But instead, she continued living as if nothing was wrong. That night, Mark hardly slept. He lay in bed, listening to her steady breathing, and thought about what he should do. Doubts plagued him. If he confronted her, she might deny everything. If he simply left, he would feel weak. The only thing he was certain of was that he could no longer remain in the dark. The next day, he decided to take the next step. He set a goal for himself: to uncover the whole truth about his wife, her actions, and who this man was. He knew that an unpleasant truth awaited him, but it was a price he was willing to pay for answers. Mark had no idea that this obsession would lead him to events that would change his life forever. The summer in Wearmont was becoming unbearably hot. Even in the dense shade of the old oaks that the city park was famous for, it was difficult to find relief. But for Mark Holloway, the heat wasn't limited to the weather. It had settled inside him, in his mind and heart, where worry and distrust now raged. From the moment he saw his wife Rachel with an unknown man and a little girl in the park, his life seemed to split into two parts: the one that existed before and the one that had come after. Every day began the same way. Mark woke up early, but instead of enjoying the fresh morning air, he spent hours lost in thought. He recalled the times when he believed their marriage was perfect. Just a few months ago, he had been proud of their life together, their home, their routines. But now, all he could think about were the scenes from the park: Rachel embracing another man, the voice of the girl calling her Mom, the laughter he had heard. It all felt too real to be a coincidence. For several days, Mark tried to convince himself that he might have misunderstood. Perhaps it was just an old friend. Perhaps the girl was just joking. But the more he thought about it, the clearer it became. He couldn't be wrong. Something in Rachel's behavior told him she wasn't being honest with him. Evenings became particularly torturous. Rachel continued leaving for her night shifts, sometimes not returning until morning. She avoided conversation, her explanations growing vaguer. In the rare moments when they were at home together, the atmosphere in the house was tense. Rachel no longer asked about his training, didn't suggest watching a movie together, or talk about weekend plans. She had become a stranger. But Mark stayed silent. He knew that without proof, any questions or accusations would be dismissed. One evening, after Rachel left, Mark decided to follow her. He waited until her car disappeared around the corner and got into his own. His heart was pounding, his hands trembling on the wheel, but he felt he was doing what needed to be done. He kept a safe distance to avoid being noticed. Rachel drove to the city hospital, but instead of going inside, she parked and walked toward a nearby car. The driver was already waiting for her. It was the same man Mark had seen in the park. They spoke briefly, after which she got into the passenger seat, and the car drove off. Mark followed them. They drove slowly, as if enjoying the ride. The car turned into a residential neighborhood filled with small, cozy houses. Mark parked at a distance and began watching. The man and Rachel got out of the car and walked toward a house with a bright red door. Soon, the door opened and a little girl ran out. She rushed to Rachel, hugged her, and then ran to the man. The three of them stood there, looking like a family. The girl was laughing, saying something, and Rachel, bending down, adjusted her hair. Then all three went inside. Mark stayed in his car. He sat motionless, watching the house. Through the window, he saw them gathering around a table in the living room. Rachel and the man were laughing, and the girl was animatedly talking, waving her hands. They looked happy, as if this was their normal life. Mark took the camera from his glove compartment and began taking pictures. He snapped several shots of the house, the car, and then focused on the windows, trying to capture their faces. He stayed there until almost midnight. The lights in the house went out, and it seemed like everyone had gone to bed. Mark returned home, feeling like he was walking on air. It felt as though he had been watching someone else's life, but at the same time, he understood that this life was somehow tied to him. He didn't sleep that night, going through the photographs over and over. In one of the pictures, Rachel was holding the girl's hand. In another, the man had his arm around her shoulders. These images felt like a verdict. The next morning, he decided to dig deeper. He opened a drawer that Rachel always kept locked. After a few minutes of fiddling with the lock, he found old letters inside. Among them were cards with children's drawings, which, judging by the handwriting, were written by a girl named Sophie. On one of the papers was a photograph of Rachel holding a baby, with the same man standing beside her. On the back of the photo was written, "Sophie, your first birthday. With love, Mom and Dad." Mark sat on the floor, holding the photograph in his hands. Everything he had learned over the past few days confirmed his worst fears. His wife had been living a double life. She had another family, another man, another daughter. All these years, he had been nothing more than a cover for something that might have begun even before their marriage. This truth tore him apart. Anger and pain overwhelmed him, mixing with a sense of helplessness. He realized he could no longer stand idly by. He had to act. Night had blanketed Weirmont in a thick shroud of silence, but in the Holloway household there was neither peace nor solace. Mark sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by darkness, illuminated only by the dim glow of a lamp. In front of him lay the photographs taken at the park and near the house, the letters, and the photograph of Rachel holding a baby with the unknown man standing beside her. These pieces of evidence felt simultaneously real and impossible. He could feel his anger building with each passing minute, but something else gnawed at him: disappointment and pain. Rachel came home late that evening, as had become the norm in recent months. Her footsteps on the wooden floor echoed in Mark's mind. He heard her set her bag down near the front door before heading to the bathroom. The sound of the shower filled the silence, but Mark remained motionless, staring at the photos in front of him. His hands trembled, and his mind grappled with one tormenting question. Why did she do this? When Rachel came out of the bathroom, wrapped in a robe with wet hair, she headed toward the bedroom but noticed Mark in the kitchen. She froze, her face briefly contorting in surprise. This was not the husband she was used to seeing. The calm, confident man always focused on his training and competitions. The man sitting before her looked threatening and hollowed out, his gaze both menacing and defeated. Mark silently placed the photographs and letters on the table in front of him. He didn't say a word, but the gesture spoke volumes. Rachel hesitated before stepping closer to look at the evidence that exposed her secret. Her face instantly turned pale, her eyes widening in shock. She glanced from the photos to Mark, but no words came. Mark rose from his chair, his movements slow and deliberate. He could feel the storm of emotion surging within him, threatening to break free, but he restrained himself. He wanted to hear the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Rachel tried to compose herself, but her voice wavered. She began to speak in fragmented, incoherent sentences, as though scrambling to justify herself or find an explanation. But none of her words could silence the truth that Mark already knew. He silently picked up the photograph, the one of her with the man and the child. He held it up so Rachel was forced to look directly at it. She took a step back, as if the photograph itself was a threat. Her excuses became increasingly disjointed. She spoke of an old friendship, claimed the girl wasn't her daughter but just the child of an acquaintance. But Mark knew it was all lies. He had seen her behavior, her expression that day in the park. It left no room for doubt. When her voice finally fell silent, Mark felt something inside him break. He realized that everything they had built together was destroyed. Her words only made things worse. His eyes darted around the room, searching for something to ground him in this instant catastrophe. But there was nothing. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, but rage consumed him. He could no longer endure the lies, could no longer bear to look at her, knowing the truth. Mark turned away from her and went to the basement. Among the sports equipment and tools, he saw the axe he used to chop wood during the winter. He picked it up, feeling the cold steel in his hands. His thoughts grew darker with each passing moment. He knew he had crossed a line, that what he was about to do would change everything forever. Yet he felt he couldn't stop. He climbed the stairs back to the living room. Rachel stood frozen in place, her face contorted in terror. She began backing away, but it was too late. Mark stepped forward, gripping the axe tightly. His actions were swift and merciless. One strike, then another. Rachel collapsed to the floor, her body limp. It all happened so quickly it felt unreal. Blood spread across the floor, forming a dark stain. Mark stood over her body, the axe still in his hand. His heart pounded wildly, and his breathing was heavy. He understood what he had done, but at the same time, he felt a strange sense of relief. It was a moment when his pain and rage had found release. But along with that came the realization that he had destroyed not only her life, but his own. He sat down on the couch, leaving the bloodied axe on the floor. His gaze was fixed on the void. Minutes passed like hours, and the silence in the house became almost unbearable. Mark picked up his phone and dialed the police. His voice was calm as he confessed to what he had done. He knew what was coming, but he no longer cared. He understood that the life he once knew was over. The police arrived 20 minutes later. They found Mark sitting on the couch. He didn't resist arrest, nor did he utter a word in his defense. His gaze was empty, his face devoid of emotion. The house that had once symbolized their love had become a crime scene, and Mark, the man who had destroyed everything he held dear. Mark Holloway sat in the interrogation room of the Wermont police station. His bloodied hands rested on the cold gray metal table, and his vacant gaze was fixed on a single spot on the wall. The officers remained calm, knowing they weren't dealing with a killer trying to hide his crime, but with a man who had voluntarily confessed. Yet Mark's outward composure did nothing to dispel the tension that hung heavily in the room. That evening, after committing the murder, Mark had called the police to report what he had done. His voice was devoid of emotion, as though he were reporting broken furniture rather than the death of his own wife. When the officers arrived, they found Holloway in the living room. He was sitting on the couch, which was soaked in blood, and a few steps away lay Rachel's body. Beside it was the axe that had been the murder weapon. It was as though time in that house had come to a halt. The officers arrested Mark without resistance. He didn't attempt to flee or offer any justification. He stood, extended his hands for the cuffs, and said only one thing. "I did it. You know where to find everything." His tone and demeanor shocked even seasoned officers. One of them later admitted he had never seen such cold determination in the eyes of someone who had just destroyed his life. Forensic experts arrived shortly after the arrest. They began photographing the scene and collecting evidence, every detail of which painted a gruesome picture of what had occurred. Blood spattered the living room walls, pooled thickly on the floor, and stained the furniture that had once been part of a cozy home. Letters, photographs, and Rachel's broken phone were collected as evidence, each item adding a personal and emotional dimension to the crime. At the station, Mark said nothing unnecessary. He answered questions briefly and without emotion. He described the events of the evening in detail, leaving out nothing. His account was precise, almost clinical. From the moment he retrieved the axe from the basement to the moment he delivered the first blow. He spoke as if narrating the actions of another person, not his own. The police tried to uncover what had driven him to commit the crime. One detective asked if he regretted what he had done, but Mark remained silent. Perhaps even he didn't know the answer. The only thing he was certain of was that he could no longer live in the lie his marriage had become. A few days later, the trial began, drawing the attention of the entire town of Wermont. The residents of the small town, accustomed to a peaceful existence, were stunned by the case. Mark Holloway was known to everyone. He had been seen as the model citizen, a successful athlete, and a devoted husband. Now he stood before them as a murderer. Newspapers were filled with headlines tying his name to the bloody crime. People discussed the events in the streets, in shops, and in cafes. Mark and Rachel's story became the main topic of conversation. In court, Mark didn't attempt to defend himself. His lawyer built a case based on emotional distress and Rachel's betrayal, arguing that it had been the catalyst for the tragedy. The prosecutor, however, asserted that no personal circumstances could justify such a brutal act. The photographs from the crime scene, recordings of Mark's calls to the police, and forensic testimony left no doubt about his guilt. As evidence, the prosecutor presented the letters found in the house, which confirmed that Rachel had been leading a double life. However, this revelation didn't garner sympathy for Mark. Many residents believed he could have simply left her or filed for divorce instead of resorting to violence. Eric Foster, Rachel's lover, learned of her death through the news. He was as shocked as the rest of his family. He had thought he knew Rachel, but now realized she had hidden just as much from him as she had from Mark. The little girl, Sophie, didn't understand what had happened. She was told that Aunt Rachel won't be able to visit anymore. Eric blamed himself for not suspecting that Rachel was married. He understood that he had inadvertently become part of this tragedy. Mark was sentenced within weeks. The court found him guilty of premeditated murder and sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. When the verdict was read, Mark didn't flinch. He didn't bow his head or utter a word. Perhaps he felt it was the only justice he deserved. After the trial, Mark was sent to a maximum security prison. In his first days there, he avoided interaction with other inmates, spending all his time in solitary confinement. He didn't try to justify himself to anyone or seek understanding. His days passed in silence, a silence that reminded him of the eerie stillness that had settled in his home after the murder. Life in Wearmont gradually returned to normal, but the shadow of the crime lingered over the town for a long time. The Holloway house remained empty. No one wanted to buy it, and neighbors avoided looking in its direction. Mark and Rachel's story became a cautionary tale for those who hide the truth. In hushed voices, people spoke of how lies and betrayal could destroy not only love, but lives. The prison world welcomed Mark Holloway with cold indifference. He was transferred to the maximum security facility Oregon Pines, a concrete fortress topped with barbed wire towering over high walls. This place became his new home. Every morning began the same way. The metallic clatter of bars, the monotone voice of a guard issuing commands, and the silence broken only by the heavy footsteps of security. On his first day, Mark was silent and withdrawn. His gaze was fixed on the empty space in front of him, his thoughts consumed by the events that had brought him there. In the communal dining hall, Mark noticed the stares of other inmates scrutinizing him. In prison, everyone knew who you were and why you were there. His case had already made the local newspapers, and many knew he had killed his wife in a fit of rage. For some, it was cause for mockery. For others, a reason to keep their distance. Crimes like his drew disdain in the prison hierarchy. Mark, however, remained unresponsive. He ate in silence, staring at his tray, and returned to his cell immediately afterward. The days in prison blurred together into an endless routine. Wake up, breakfast, work detail, time in the common area, dinner, and back to the cell. In the solitude of his small cell, Mark replayed the events of that night over and over. The image haunted him. Rachel lying on the floor, dark bloodstains spreading across the wooden parquet. He tried to pinpoint the moment he had broken, the line he had crossed that separated man from beast. His memories intertwined with the emptiness that now filled his life. His cell was tiny, with concrete walls and a narrow window that barely let in any light. He spent long hours there, reflecting on his actions. Sometimes he picked up the notebook he had gotten from the library and began to write. He wrote down everything swirling in his mind, memories of their marriage, images of Rachel, her smile, her touch. But then his thoughts would darken. He remembered her lies, her double life, and the daughter she had hidden from him. These writings brought no relief but gave him a way to organize the chaos in his mind. Over time, Mark began to notice the other inmates. Each of them lived in their own world, haunted by their own demons and stories. One inmate, Trevor, frequently approached him with biting comments about his crime. His words were sharp and deliberately provocative. "So, buddy, was it worth it? You could have just left her. Or were you afraid her lover was better than you?" Mark never responded. He knew Trevor's taunts echoed his own inner thoughts. Sometimes he heard those very questions inside his head. The only solace Mark found was in books. The prison library had a modest selection, but he found works that helped him distract himself. He read about the nature of anger, the psychology of betrayal, and how people cope with internal pain. These books forced him to confront the deeper reasons for his actions. He began to understand that Rachel's infidelity was just the tip of the iceberg. The real cause of his actions lay deeper, in his inability to manage his own emotions. Mark's lawyer visited the prison several times to discuss matters related to the remaining property. Mark transferred everything to Rachel's family, renouncing his share entirely. It was the only way he could try to atone for his guilt. One day, the lawyer informed him that Eric Foster, Rachel's lover, had testified in court. Eric claimed he had no knowledge of Rachel's marriage and had never met Mark. This news only added to Mark's bitterness. Eric, it turned out, had been as much a victim of Rachel's deceit as he was. Prison was a place where time lost all meaning. Each morning felt like the last, and the days became an endless cycle of routine tasks. Mark tried to find purpose in this new existence. He began exercising in the prison yard, attempting to regain his physical form, but it felt more like going through the motions than genuine training. Sometimes he thought back to his competitions, the cheering crowds, the roar of the stands. Those memories felt as if they belonged to another life. The nights were the hardest. When the prison fell into silence, Mark was plagued by nightmares. He dreamed of Rachel, her voice, her smile. But each time the dream turned into a nightmare, and he saw her lying on the floor, bloodied, her eyes empty. These dreams tore him apart, forcing him to wake in a cold sweat. He knew this image would haunt him forever. Months passed, yet Mark found no answers to his questions. He began to realize that his life no longer had a future, only a past he could not escape. He no longer wondered why Rachel had done what she did. Now, the only question that consumed him was why he hadn't been able to stop himself. Mark Holloway had been in prison for almost a year, and during that time, his world had shrunk to concrete walls, the clatter of steel doors, and the monotony of routine. Time in this place stretched out, becoming an endless stream of identical days. He no longer counted weeks or months. They had lost all meaning. The only constant was the memories that haunted him every night. It seemed that the other inmates had come to accept him as just another fixture of their environment. Trevor and the others no longer taunted him, realizing that Mark preferred solitude and avoided conflict. His silence was perceived as strength, though in reality it was simply a desire to remain unnoticed. But even in prison, rumors persisted. His story had become part of the prison's mythology, another tragic tale whispered about in the dining hall or during outdoor breaks. About a year after his sentencing, Mark received an unexpected letter. It arrived in a small envelope with no return address. When he opened it, he found a neatly written note. There were only a few lines. "I didn't know. If I had, I never would have allowed it. But she deceived both of us. Take care of yourself. Eric." Those few words gave him pause. Eric was a part of Rachel's life that Mark had never understood, a part of her deception that had led to tragedy. Now, after all this time, the letter only confirmed what Mark already knew. Their lives had been destroyed not just by Rachel's betrayal, but by Mark's inability to cope with the pain and anger it caused. He stared at the letter for a long time before folding it neatly and tucking it into his notebook. Prison was a place where people found ways to survive. Some turned to violence, others sought solace in religion, and still others surrendered entirely to apathy. Mark didn't fit into any of these categories. His solace remained in books, his notebook, and isolation. Every evening, he sat on his narrow cot, opened the notebook, and wrote. Sometimes it was memories, sometimes reflections on who he had become and what had led him to this moment. He tried to understand what had turned him into the man who had picked up the axe that night. Was it a moment of weakness or the culmination of years of pain? Mark knew it wasn't just a fit of rage. It was something deeper, a loss of control, a need to punish, a desperate attempt to rid himself of the pain tearing him apart. But the retribution had only brought emptiness. One day, a prison chaplain visited. He offered to talk to inmates, to listen, to give them a chance to unburden themselves. Mark avoided him at first, but eventually decided to sit across from him. The chaplain was an older man with kind but weary eyes. He didn't ask questions or push Mark to speak. He simply sat quietly, letting Mark know he was there to listen if needed. Mark sat in silence for a long time before finally saying, "I killed her because I couldn't take it anymore. But it didn't change anything. Nothing. She's dead, and I'm empty." The chaplain studied him carefully but didn't offer comforting words. Instead, he asked, "What are you going to do with that emptiness?" The question caught Mark off guard. He didn't know the answer. He had never thought about what came next because he believed there was no next for him. It took weeks before Mark found an answer. He began participating in a prison program to help new inmates adjust. He explained the rules, showed them how to navigate the system, and offered guidance on surviving in this harsh environment. He wasn't seeking redemption, but it gave him a small sense of purpose. He no longer wrote letters to Rachel. He knew he could never undo what he had done, but he tried to avoid causing further harm. His days remained gray and monotonous, but within him grew a quiet determination. He no longer asked himself why it had happened. Instead, he focused on finding a way to live with the pain. Mark knew he would never leave the walls of this prison, but he hoped that one day he might forgive himself. Rachel's family never reached out to him again. Eric, it seemed, had stopped writing. Weirmont had forgotten him, as it forgets all those who end up behind bars. But Mark knew his story would remain with him forever. It was a part of him, a part of the emptiness he carried inside. One final time he opened his notebook and wrote a single sentence. "You destroyed me, but I destroyed us both." Then he closed the notebook and placed it in the corner of his cell. He had nothing left to say. 3 years had passed since Mark Holloway entered the walls of Oregon Pines and remained behind them forever. In that time, life beyond the prison continued as usual, but Mark was no longer part of it. He had become a shadow trapped in a concrete box, a man whose story had turned into legend for those who heard of his crime and a bitter memory for those who had once known him. Prison had changed him. His face had grown gaunt, his skin pale from lack of sunlight, and his eyes darkened with weariness. But the most profound change was internal. The anger that once burned inside him had cooled into a quiet acceptance. Mark no longer asked why. He knew the answers would not change the past. Now he focused only on the present, trying to find some semblance of meaning in it. One gray morning, like countless others before it, Mark was summoned to the warden's office. It was a rare occurrence as Mark never caused trouble or drew unnecessary attention. Walking down the long corridor, he felt the watchful eyes of guards and inmates alike. When he entered the small office, the warden, a man in his 50s with closely cropped gray hair and a stern gaze, was seated behind the desk. On the desk lay an envelope. The warden slid it toward Mark and gestured for him to open it. Mark picked up the envelope, marked only with his inmate number, and carefully tore it open. Inside was a short letter, just a few lines, but each one struck him deeply. Mark, I know this hasn't been easy for you, but I can't let it go unsaid. You were part of my life, even if you didn't realize it. I forgive you. Sophie forgives you. Now you need to forgive yourself. Eric. Mark stared at the letter for a long time, saying nothing. His hands trembled slightly, but his expression remained stoic. He didn't know what he had expected, but these words broke through the last of the defenses he had built over the years. Carefully, he folded the letter and tucked it into the pocket of his uniform. When he returned to his cell, he sat on his cot for a long time, holding the letter as though it could somehow provide the answers to the questions that still tormented him. A few weeks later, Mark was offered a job in the prison woodworking shop. It was a rare opportunity, given only to inmates who had proven themselves disciplined and reliable. He accepted without hesitation. Working with wood proved to be almost meditative for him. He learned to carve simple shapes, build stools, shelves, and picture frames. Each time his hands touched the wood, he felt a connection to something tangible, almost alive. It was the most meaningful thing he could do in his new life. In the workshop, Mark began creating small wooden figurines. One day, he carved a duck, a perfect replica of the ones he had seen in the city park where he first noticed Rachel with her second family. Another time, he carved a house with a bright red door, like the one they had lived in together. Each figure became a piece of his past, but instead of pain, he now felt something different. It was an attempt to reconcile with what he could never change. The prison guards and other inmates noticed the change in Mark. He became calmer, almost invisible. He rarely spoke, but was always willing to help when asked. His work in the shop caught the attention of staff, and one day they asked him to create something for a prison exhibition. It was a small gesture, but for Mark, it was an opportunity. He carved a figure of a man sitting on a bench, surrounded by birds. The work was simple but carried a depth that everyone immediately recognized. In the spring of 1999, Mark received another letter. This time it was from Sophie. She was old enough now to write it herself. In the letter, she explained that she knew the full truth about her mother, about Mark, and about what had happened. To Mark's surprise, the letter wasn't filled with anger. Instead, she wrote that she hoped to meet him one day. Her words weren't naive but mature, carrying a weight that softened something inside him. I know what you did, and I can't say I understand it, but I believe everyone deserves a chance to become better. You do too. Sophie. These words stirred something in Mark. He realized that perhaps his life wasn't entirely destroyed. Maybe he still had a chance to leave something good behind. Mark continued working in the workshop, making wooden toys that were sent to children's shelters. The toys were small and simple, but each one carried meaning. In them, he poured all the emotions he couldn't express in words. By the end of that year, Mark wrote his first letter to Sophie. He spent a long time thinking about what to say, but ultimately decided to keep it brief. He apologized for the pain he had caused and thanked her for her kind words. He didn't expect a reply, but that didn't matter. For the first time in years, he felt like he had done something right. In 2000, the prison organized a memorial wall where inmates could leave their thoughts or artwork. Mark carved a wooden plaque with a simple inscription. Sometimes we find ourselves only after we've lost everything. The plaque found its place on the wall, becoming a symbol of his journey, from destruction to an attempt at understanding and acceptance.